living with Joe McCarthy, the idea of getting back and talking about the Pullman Porters is an extraordinary pleasure. If you've also wrote a book 20 years ago on the Pullman Porters, it's sometimes difficult to remember everything you're supposed to remember. So I'm going to do something strange here, which is hand out just the people who happen to be in the front. You get stuck with helping me out on my talk a little bit here. And those are, as a journalist, I learned to think about the world in terms of the 5 W's. Anybody know what the 5 W's are? Right, exactly. And so these are my 5 W's on the Pullman Porters, and they're going to help us structure a talk here and make sure I get through quickly enough so that we can do the most fun part, which is hearing your real questions, not my setup questions. In the yellow sweater there, could you, in a loud voice, read question number 1 to us?
Who the heck are the Pullman Porters anyway?
Right, so for the sake of the cameras back there, I'm going to repeat all the questions. It's not just that I'm obsessive, and it's and the question was, who the heck are the Pullman Porters anyway? And I want to give you, probably most of you know who the Pullman Porters were, but I want to just give you a little sense of where their story came from. And their story began at the end of the Civil War in America. And there was a guy named George Pullman who had a vision for himself. And the vision was to make a whole lot of money. And he wasn't quite sure how to do it. And he tried a lot of things. He tried moving houses. He tried any kind of scheme that he could think of. And he was smart enough, having ridden on trains across America, to know that it was a really back-breaking exercise to take one of these incredibly uncomfortable train rides across the country. And he decided that he could make a fortune if he could have a really elegant way of moving people across America. And he decided what was essential was having a beautiful car like the one here on the Hildene grounds that had elegant places to sleep, that gave you as good a meal as you could get in the best restaurants across the country. But he decided that one thing was more important than anything, and what you would remember more importantly than anything was whether you got good service. And so he looked around him in the late 1800s and tried to think, who could I hire that's going to give the best service that you could ever get anywhere? And he decided that ex-slaves were the people. They had had essentially their PhD in servitude. And he hired them en masse, knowing that they knew how to take care of people and that they would work incredibly cheap because they were just freed slaves. And so there are 2 ways of looking at who George Pullman was. Either he was the most exploitative, cynical guy in the world, or he was somebody who was giving these ex-slaves the best opportunity that they could ever have. And you got to remember, at an era when slavery was ending in America, this was one of the only opportunities for people who had spent their life working as slaves in the field to have a job that was a non-agricultural job, to have a job where they could actually see the country. These were people who had spent their lives in the most miserable kind of work there was. So if you're an optimist, or if you're a generous person, you would say that George Pullman was giving the ex-slaves an opportunity. And if you're a realist, he would say he was giving them an opportunity that was going to make them have a life that was only slightly better than the life of servitude they had come from. And he was really both. He was a little bit of a good guy and a little bit of a good guy only if it would help him. The bottom line is that whatever his motivation, his judgment on what it would take to get people to pay a whole lot of money to go across country on his sleeping cars was perfectly timed and perfectly aimed. It was, anybody here, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, nobody here is old enough to have actually ridden in a Pullman sleeping car? Did you?
No.
So what do you remember about it?
I remember that you hoped that they had the canvas sidewalls tightly fixed, because as you walked down the lane, the aisle between them on a rough road, you would lurch back and forth.
Yes.
So that's one very vivid memory.
So that is a wonderful memory, the idea that as you were walking down these incredibly narrow corridors, A, you had to be relatively thin, B, you had to be relatively short, and C, you had to be incredibly dexterous in terms of generally how you would handle yourself. And in this tight quarter of a Pullman sleeping car, we saw a really extraordinary piece of race history in America play out. And it didn't just play out in the era when slavery was ending, it played out for an entire 100 years, from the 1860s to the late 1960s, when the last Pullman cars were coming off the assembly line. And we saw 100 years, again in that tight quarter, of race history playing out in America. We saw these guys who were Pullman porters do everything from make up your bed at night to be up all night in case the heat was too high or it was too low, in case you had any kind of complaint. They would take care of helping people change their babies' diapers. They would take care of your children. People sent their children on cross-country trips across America, a largely racist country that entrusted their kids to these black men called Pullman porters because they knew that they were going to get extraordinary care taken of your kids when they went off to visit their grandparents or whatever they were doing across country. We had amazing scenes of mysteries and of romance taking place in these Pullman sleeping cars. A single guy would come in berth A, and a single woman would come in berth B, and by the end of the trip, they were a couple. And the Pullman porters were the perfect people to keep all the secrets, because berth A might really be married to somebody else in berth B, but these guys were going to keep your secrets in a way that was guaranteed because they had, again, earned their PhD in how to be the perfect servants. They also were going to keep the secrets because if they didn't, they were not going to have a job. One mistake on a Pullman sleeping car, you took somebody's shoes at night and you wrote on the bottom of the soles of the shoes what berth those shoes belonged with. If they ended up in the wrong berth, you might not have a job again, because George Pullman insisted that he had an entire rule book, and that rule book dictated just what they had to do. So it was an extraordinary adventure. It was a way to make George Pullman money, but it was an amazing opportunity for black men who could see the country. There was an expression for about 75 years of the Pullman Company that the two best jobs that a black man could get in America were, we know one of them was what? Pullman, because that's what we're here talking about, and I wouldn't have brought it up. What was the other? Anybody have any idea what the best job? Say it again? Well, that's a very good guess, but that's actually not what it was. Say it again? Barber, so another good guess, and a barber was not a bad job, and we all know wonderful stories. And an elevator operator. So that was a good one. What do you think?
Post office.
Post office. That is exactly right. And the fact that she's my wife saying doesn't mean anything. So the expression in black America was Pullman and postal. Those were the two best jobs a black man could get. The first of any of the federal agencies that opened up to hiring blacks was the post office, and that was, in terms of what you could get as a salary, that was a great job. Only postal workers spent their days in a post office, and that was not exactly a way to see America and experience a broader world. Pullman, I think, had 3 levels beyond that, because they were traveling around the country. They were traveling with the wealthiest people in America. They picked up stock tips. They got a sense of how the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and people like that lived, and they got to see something quite magical. So, have I answered question A well enough? I think let's go on to, ma'am, here. Could you read in a loud, booming voice question number 2 there?
1 second. What makes the Porter's story worth telling?
Right. So I want to say, what makes a Porter story worth telling? And she said it very politely. Say, the real question is, why would we come out on a beautiful day outside to come in and hear somebody just talk about Pullman porters and elegant train service? And the answer is, First of all, because there were some very special people in America who were Pullman porters. Everybody knows who Malcolm X was? Did you know before Malcolm X became this great civil rights worker, where he learned about race relations in America was by being a porter. He saw it play out in the narrow confines again of a train what race in America was like. You may have heard of Gordon Parks, the famous photographer. Gordon Parks was a Pullman porter. LA Mayor Tom Bradley, one of the first mayors of the big city in America, one of the first black mayors, Pullman porter. More extraordinary people got their early tutelage on what America was really like by working as a Pullman porter. The reason, though, this story matters, I think, 50 years after the Pullman companies have gone out of business, the reason we're still talking about Pullman porters is because they did some amazing things in America. It was not just the fact that for a while the Pullman Company was the single biggest employer of black men in America. And I mean the single big companies, whatever it was, they were number one. But the porters did three things that I think really make them an extraordinary story. And I don't know what everybody's politics here is, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand to tell me what you think of anything, but I think it's a story that in this era of Trump is especially resonant and that we have to remind ourselves. And we have to remind ourselves in what may be the most lily white state in America, of Vermont, the story of black America that matters. Reason number one is that the first black trade union in America, the first time blacks were the Pullman porters, what was it called? Do you remember? Brotherhood, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was extraordinary. Blacks had tried to organize in lots of industries for a long time and never succeeded in doing it. And it looked like they were about to fail in doing it with the Pullman sleeping car porters as well, until an amazing guy came along named A. Philip Randolph. And he was amazing partly because he had never ridden on a Pullman train and he knew nothing about porters and their circumstances. And he had failed in just about everything he had tried to do professionally in his young life. So he knew this was his last shot, and the porters knew after years of trying and George Pullman beating them back, they knew they had one more shot. And it was a perfect synchrony of motives. You have the porters who are desperate to get organization. You have a guy who's desperate to show that he can do something and not fail at it. And he was also something that Vermonters can relate to. He was a democratic socialist. And that was not exactly the guy that you wanted to say, we're going to take on the biggest company in the train world, but it worked. He was a brilliant organizer. He had the support of the members in a way that got to be extraordinary, and cynical or skeptical members who didn't want to lose this incredible job of being a Pullman porter believed in A. Philip Randolph. He took on the company. He took on George Pullman. He took on your patron saint here, Robert Todd Lincoln, and he won. And he organized a black trade union, and that meant something. If that's reason number one, an even more important reason is the Pullman porters played an extraordinary role in America in launching the civil rights movement. Anybody have any idea, where did the civil rights movement, what was the event in America that signaled the dawn of the civil rights movement? Not garbage trucks, what was the? Rosa Parks, and what was that part of? It was Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. So who was the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott? No, it was Martin Luther King Jr. was the leader of the bus boycott. But Martin Luther King Jr. was not supposed to be the leader of the bus boycott. The real leader behind the scenes is a man that my guess is all but a couple of you would never have heard of. And his name was Edgar D. Nixon, E.D. Nixon. And E.D. Nixon was the one who recruited Rosa Parks. It was not an accident that Rosa Parks said, I'm not going to give up my seat. She had been trained to do that, and she was a very smart woman, and they knew exactly what was going to happen when Rosa Parks said, I'm not going to give up my seat. And the guy who orchestrated all of this, who sent her for her training, was this guy named E.D. Nixon. And he was all ready to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. But he had a problem. E.D. Nixon in Montgomery ran the local office of the sleeping car porters. He was himself a porter. And his problem was that he was out there on the trains all the time, and he couldn't be around to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. So he picked a callow but smart young minister by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. And he said, "You will be the guy who will be here. I'm going to be behind the scenes pulling the strings with you, but you're the guy who's going to be the out front guy. You're a smart guy, you're an eloquent guy, and you're a guy who's is young enough that you'll take all my orders, and you'll be out there leading this." So next time you think about Martin Luther King, realize that behind the scenes, it was a Pullman porter who knighted him and said, "You will become what he became." It was in an era when civil rights organizers had nowhere to meet. You know where they met? They met in one place. There were offices all across America, which was in the offices of which?
Post office.
Not the post office. No. I want to give you a hint. Anytime I ask a question, all you have to say is Pullman Porter. So they met in the office of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters because they had big offices. They loved what the civil rights movement was doing, and that was the easy place. Where did they get their money for a civil rights movement that had no money?
Pullman Porter.
One of the only organized places in Black America back then was this successful union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. They gave them the leadership, they gave them the money, they gave them the place to meet. Next time you think about the civil rights movement and the history of it, whether it's Black History Month or on Martin Luther King's birthday, realize that these Pullman porters were an extraordinary force behind that. They gave us a trade union, they gave us in many ways the civil rights movement, but their biggest contribution of all was in their sons and daughters, their nieces and their nephews. And I want to just tell you a few of them. I'm convinced, so I want to name some names. Thurgood Marshall, you've heard of, son of a Ron Dellums, the famous congressman from California, son of a Willie Brown, the mayor of San Francisco, son of a porter. And this one is a little bit tougher, and I wished very selfishly that she had been around and we knew who she was when I had written my book. The great-granddaughter of a Pullman porter is, to me, the most symbolic of all in terms of the success of the Pullman porters, and it is a woman named Michelle Obama. And it is not an accident that all these people are the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of Pullman porters. The place where black men could see how the world worked and get a sense of what their children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren could do someday was by working in these Pullman cars, getting stock tips and ideas on big ideas on how the world worked, is these Pullman porters. And they came back and they made it work in a way that was extraordinary. And I became convinced that if you named for me in the field of science or engineering, in the field of politics or human relations, a prominent African American, I could find somewhere in their background a Pullman porter. And the only place that I couldn't find that, I actually, when I would go talk to classes, I offered a cash bonus to any student who could find a Pullman porter in the background of the one person who overnight could have sold out my book in every bookstore in the world, and that was a woman named Oprah Winfrey. And the only prominent African American who doesn't have a Pullman porter, at least one that I've been able to discover in their background, is Oprah. But again, when you consider how few Pullman porters there were, and how many people they influenced, it was extraordinary. So their union, the civil rights movement, but most important of all was their descendants, who were an extraordinary group. And I want to tell you just really quickly about one of those descendants. And it was a man that I interviewed named Lawrence Happy Davis. And his story, to me, said it all. And I actually, before I tell you his story, sir, could you read me? This will fit in with our question number 3. What is our question number 3 there?
When do we get the to hear the personal stuff.
Yeah, enough of this politics. When do we get to hear what these people were like as human beings? And I want to go to this guy, Lawrence Happy Davis, and the story he told. And I want to tell you before I do that, that when I started writing my book, I could find 50 Pullman porters in America who were still around. And the youngest of them was in their late 80s, the oldest was 102, and it was not easy finding them, but there were 50 of them around. That was the good news. The bad news was the year of research and the year it takes for a publisher to actually turn out your book when you've handed it in. That was 2 years from the time I began. In that time, half of them died. Today, there are no Pullman porters. It's tough to find the child of a Pullman porter who's around 20 years later. But one of the guys that I talked to was this guy named Lawrence Happy Davis. And I asked him, obviously, what it was like working in the Pullman cars. And he said that it was when they went into Jim Crow Southern America in that era, it was like going behind the Iron Curtain. And they would have either starved to death or gotten themselves shot if they went into the wrong restaurant and tried to get served, or the wrong hotel and tried to book a room. It was that dangerous. You may have seen a movie called The Green Book.
Yeah.
Well, it was worse than The Green Book. And they were saved by a word-of-mouth network that they developed on where the safe places were to go and eat or to go and sleep. They were saved by people he described as Ruby in Fort Worth, or Nellie in New York, or Tiny, and he said she was anything but tiny, in Tampa. And this was their informal network. They didn't need a written green book. They told one another in all their trips to the South, this is the boarding house that we know we can go and that they will welcome us. And it was a way of having this underground network that was extraordinary, and it was a way literally of staying alive. He also talked about what it was like being away from home at one point for 47 consecutive days. Being away from the family that he left at home, the kids that were without a dad for 47 days. He described what it was like working for what he called the most prejudiced company in the world. And that was the downside. The upside was that when he came home with more money in his pocket, partly because A. Philip Randolph had helped the porters see their salary go up, and partly because George Pullman had realized from the beginning that porters depending on tips was a way of him being assured they were going to give great service. It was like going into a restaurant. Whether the waiter or waitress likes you or not, they are, especially as the meal nears an end, going to be incredibly attentive to you because they know that your tip depends on how you're feeling when you're walking out the door or before you walk out the door. George Pullman knew that porters were going to do anything that a passenger asked because the tips that they depended on for half their salary were what made the difference in whether their kids were going to be able to go to college someday. So Lawrence Happy Davis talked about the bad side of being a Pullman porter, but also about this extraordinary opportunity. He said that he got to meet members of the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Yankees. He got to know Woody Herman and Count Basie and Sammy Davis Jr. He got to know, from having put a headboard under his bed over all these years of carrying him, a guy that you may have remembered named John F. Kennedy, who had a bad back, who traveled on Pullman sleeping cars, and who depended on the porters to know that he needed a wooden board under his bed to be able to sleep at night. Now, this is not exactly the experience of the average black man in America in that era, that they got to hang out with John F. Kennedy and Woody Herman and Count Basie. But that's what these porters did. But rather than trusting my version of it, we're going to do a test. We have the recorder. We're going to hope that you can hear this. But this is one of the porters telling their own story. And it's a story that I think is an extraordinary story that you may or may not be able to pick up on this old cassette tape recorder. But Stephanie, who is brilliant at everything, is going to try to make this work.
And this is a pitch for Lincoln Hall, where we'll have much better facilities. Here we go.
Great. So let's see whether...
When did this interview take place?
So this interview took place about 30 years ago. It was at a conference in Washington.
Just have them out on the floor.
on the Pullman car. All of us
This is it.
porters had our own way of working the car, treating the passenger, and be treated by the passenger. I had an incident once that I picked up a passenger out of New York. I was running down to Norfolk, Virginia. During the quiet of the evening, when you finish all your work, you usually go into the smoking room. That's where we sit back in the old days because we didn't have a quarters. We sit in the smoking room. After I finished my work, I was sitting down in the smoking room, and a gentleman come in and says, "Do you mind if I talk to you, Porter?" I says, "No." I says, "What's on your mind?" And every time that this gentleman would make a sentence, he would ask me, "Is it all right to talk to you? You don't mind it, do you?" He would give me $1, and he was telling me a story about why his wife was crying. His wife was in the lower berth, and he was in the smoking room talking to me. So he said, "I just come back from New York." He said, "Do you see my wife in that crying?" I said, "Yes, I saw her. What's the matter with her?" And he says, "Well, we just come back to New York to see my daughter." Then he would pause and give me another $1. "You don't mind if I tell you the story, do you?" I said, "No, go ahead and tell me." So I says, "What's the matter?" He says, "My daughter just married." I said, "Well, that should be good news." He said, "No, it's not. It's disturbing my wife. We went up together and she wouldn't come back with us." I said, "Well, you know, when you leave someplace and get married, you want to stay with your husband." He said, "No, that's not why my wife is crying. I went up to get her because she had just married a Negro." And he started crying.
So I tell you that story, or he tells you, William Miller tells you that story, because I think it not only tells a story about racism in America, but it tells a story about these porters' extraordinary sense of humor. That he could do it, tell that story in that set-up way to give you a sense of, instead of pounding you over the head with a story of racism in America, to make you laugh with him at a story of racism in America. And I want to tell you, just about every one of the porters I interviewed, and as I said, it was 40, 50 of them that I talked to, had something extraordinary that was part of their story. And what was extraordinary is that they were telling me those stories for the first time they told them to anybody. And it was not because they liked me or I was especially charming. It was because they were getting old and they had kept these stories in for all these years. It was like in an earlier book, I wrote a book on the Jewish diaspora, and I interviewed scores of Holocaust survivors. And their stories were so painful that they often didn't tell the stories to their children and grandchildren. They didn't want to relive their pain. They didn't want to let them know about these excruciating experiences they had gone through. It was the same thing with the Pullman porters. They had had extraordinary opportunities, but they had gone through such hell and had taken such a beating, emotionally and sometimes physically, over the years as Pullman porters, that they didn't want to tell the stories. And they told them to me because they wanted someday their children and grandchildren to be able to read those stories. They didn't want to take the stories with them to their grave. And so the William Millers in the world, the Happy Davises in the world, wanted somebody someday to hear them. And they would be so delighted to be able to go on the grounds of Hildene here and see one of their sleeping cars, and not just see the elegant sleeping car, but be able to have these brilliant docents tell them the story about how this is a story of race in America. And this is, I continue to believe, I almost was convinced that this wasn't going to be true, and that during the Barack Obama years, I thought naively that maybe we were moving to a post-racial society, whatever the heck that meant. Well, clearly, we are not in that world. And I think more than ever, we have to understand the story that Hildine is telling here at their Pullman sleeping car, and that we're talking about here today, which is the story of the Pullman Porters and the way they are a lens into our history and into where we are today. Sir, could you do me a favor and read question number 4 there?
Okay. Where did you find these ancient porters when you were writing your book? And where did Hildine and Robert Todd Lincoln fit into the story?
Right, so the less sensitive part of that question is, where did I find them? And that's just a question of what you do as a journalist and an author. And I want to give you just a really brief sketch of, it's not easy. You're trying to find guys who are in their 80s, 90s, and 100. And they're not just out there saying, I'm an ex-Pullman porter, come talk to me. So you do everything. You try the low-tech version of you call all the normal suspects. And I realized, I don't know where you would turn. Anybody have an idea, if you were going into a community, let's say the community of Boston, or Chicago or New York, where there were lots of Pullman porters, how would you find them? Who would you ask?
Baptist Church.
Say it again?
Baptist Church.
Well, so that's a really good answer, and I wasn't smart enough at the beginning. I thought the people you would ask is you'd go to the Jesse Jacksons of the world, the public political figures. And in fact, they knew vaguely about the story of the Pullman Porters, but they had no idea. But you go to ministers, that's a really good.
And the pension checks.
And the pension checks, right. So,
Census.
census records, another good idea. Maybe somebody said earlier, barbershops, not a bad idea. The best idea of all, and the one that I was too dumb to come to until late in the process, is we're talking about people of a certain age. Where do you go to find people of a certain age?
Senior citizens.
Exactly. Senior citizen centers and nursing homes. And you go to nursing homes with lots of black residents, and you ask around there. And you realize that if they aren't a Pullman porter, they know where there were Pullman porters in their community. And if you get to, once you get to one in a town, you would come across lots of others. I also started putting ads in African American newspapers like the Amsterdam News and the Chicago Defender. I put ads in retirement magazines. I put ads in railroad retirement magazines. I went to all the unions to talk to them. I went to Amtrak, which was clueless on all of this, and they were Pullman porters. But exactly. So once you go and you start getting your first ones, you start getting more, and they start developing. But the second half of your question, if I remember, was what is Robert Todd Lincoln's role in this? And Robert Todd Lincoln had a really interesting role. So we all know that Robert Todd Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln's son, but the guy who fathered him arguably more than Abraham Lincoln was George Pullman. And George Pullman we've already talked about. He was the guy who wanted to make money and realized this was the way to make it. And he was a guy who was partly benefactor, partly cynic. Robert Todd Lincoln took on all those same attributes. He ran the Pullman Company. When you looked at his time actually running the company as president, and then his time after that as chairman, it was about a quarter of a century that Robert Todd Lincoln was in a position that mattered with this company. And he did some things that were extraordinary. He built a successful company into an even more successful company. So if you look at, how many acres are we here again?
412.
Right, so not exactly even in that era, not cheap to build a house like this amazing house here and buy 412 acres. So that was a sign of how successful his Pullman Company became. So the question is, did Robert Todd Lincoln help the Pullman porters with all of their advancement and their unions? Did he shut them down and try to squelch all of that activity? And what do you think the answer is? Was he the good guy? Was he the bad guy? Was he?
You wouldn't be telling us if it wasn't bad.
So
Both.
he was both. The correct answer is he was both. He was overseeing the company during a lot of their most successful union organizing. He was discouraging all of that successful union organizing, He was smart enough not to leave a paper trail so we can answer definitively. He may have, when he testified in Congress about his role with the unions, he may have perjured himself. My guess is he did, but I can't prove that. So he was, in a way, George Pullman's perfect successor. He changed to some extent as the times changed, but he maintained the profitability of the company by paying their black workers and their white workers as little as somebody could get away with doing, because that's what corporate titans did in the Gilded Age. And he was, in a way, our perfect lens for seeing the Pullman Company and that era of race relations. He was a story that was everything. And if you liked him and you wanted to be his defender, you could find lots of reasons to defend him. And if you were willing to look deeper and you were more cynical, like journalists like me are by definition, you find lots of bad things with him. So I think that it is an ultimate tribute to Robert Todd Lincoln that Hildene tells as honest a story of him and what the Pullman Company represented as it does. I also can't help but saying, and anybody who's a Robert Todd Lincoln fan can block their ears for 1 minute, but what people like Happy Davis and other Pullman porters told me, their line was, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves and Robert Todd Lincoln re-enslaved them with a form of industrial slavery in America. And I think that wasn't so far off the mark, that he was no different than any other industrial titan, he just happened to have more black employees. And I think that it might be true to say that his father would have a little bit turned over in his grave to see some of the things that went on at the Pullman Company under George Pullman's reign and under Robert Todd Lincoln's reign. But I can't ask Abe Lincoln whether that's true, and I can't ask Robert Todd Lincoln what the real truth was in everything that he did. But I think it's a really interesting way of looking at the larger story of the Pullman Company, partly enabler, partly enslaver. Good. Would you read in a loud voice question number 5?
Why were you interested in the porters, and why should we trust a middle-aged white guy like you to tell this consummately black narrative?
Right. So actually, I must have written these questions a long time ago. Now I look back fondly at middle age, and I think but I'm still a white guy, and that was the question. When I showed up on their doorstep, so I called in advance, or I had researchers who were helping me, and we called in advance to set up the interviews with all these porters all across America. And I traveled across the country a lot to find them, only to discover in the end that there were more of them in my hometown of Boston than there were anywhere else in America, because Boston was one of the terminus points. But when I showed up on their doorstep, the initial look that I got from the porters who opened the door was, we thought you were going to be black. And why should we be telling a white guy like you this story? There is I can't remember the author's name, but there's a big controversy going on now about whether a Hispanic author of the book, right. So whether that's a legitimate storyteller of a story that is a Latino story, and is it okay for a non-Latino to tell it the way she did? Well, I'm a white guy, and I told this story, and the porters, my biggest enablers in doing it were the porters. And after about 5 minutes of conversation, the look turned out to, it transformed from, what's a white guy like you doing on our doorstep asking us to tell this story, to, you could be green and be from the planet Mars, and you're the guy who's here to tell our story. We might not be around tomorrow or next month to tell it to somebody else, and if you're willing to listen and turn on your tape recorder, we'll tell it to you. And they were extraordinarily generous in telling their story, and the reason I cared about their story was I had done 20-something years ago this brilliant year of being a journalist that's called the Nieman Fellowship. And it's when you're paid to be a journalist but don't have to do any journalism. You come, 12 American, 12 overseas journalists come to Harvard for a year and are given, like Cinderella, a gift and said, you are special. At the end of the year, at the 5 minutes after the year is over, you're back to being a char lady, but for this year you can do anything you want. You can take courses, you don't have to do the work in the courses. You want to pretend you're a doctor and go to medical school courses, you can do that. And I took advantage of the year by taking endless courses and trying to understand lots of things that as a journalist I never had time to explore. And I took a course from a strange professor who was in the design school, the architecture school at Harvard. And the course, all the students, the course had some long fancy name, but students called the course gas stations. And it was teaching you how, as a non-architect, to look at the built world and understand it. And this professor, for some reason that I still don't understand, was obsessed with the Pullman Porters. He thought they were the story of America and that somebody had to tell the story. So every few months after I ended my Neiman Fellowship, I would call this professor on the phone and I would say, are you doing the story, the book on the Pullman Porters? And he would say, no. And after the 5th or the 10th, or I don't remember how many phone calls, he finally said, this is your book now, it's your obsession, you've got to go do this. And I thought it was the perfect story, again, because it was the narrow story in the confines of the sleeping car that was telling the story of race in America. And I told that story in a way that I didn't understand that it was going to be the gift that kept on giving. And I want to just end my talk today by telling you the ways that gift has given back to me. The Pullman Porters told me, when I interviewed them, that someday I had to, when I got done writing a book about them, I had to write a book about their favorite passenger. And their favorite passenger was a baseball player that you may recognize named Satchel Paige. And Satchel Paige was, to me, another brilliant story to be told. And I wrote a biography of Satchel Paige. And it was, again, not just Satchel Paige. He was the most famous and the most emblematic of the Negro Leaguers. And I don't know if you know, but Satchel Paige was born the year that the Jim Crow laws passed in his native Alabama. And Satchel Paige should have been the one, not Jackie Robinson, who integrated baseball, because Jackie Robinson was only known to Branch Rickey, the guy who ran the Brooklyn Dodgers, because he was a second-string second baseman on Satchel Paige's Kansas City Monarchs. And he was picked by Branch Rickey rather than Satchel Paige, not just because Satchel Paige was 200 years old, but because Satchel Paige would do what Jackie Robinson would do what Branch Rickey told him to do, and Satchel Paige never did what anybody told him to do. And he was such a character and so wonderful of free spirit that he ended up helping integrate a baseball team after the Jackie Robinson did. But if you asked any old Negro Leaguer, they would say what one Negro Leaguer said to me, which was, it was Satchel Paige, it was Branch Rickey who walked through the door. I'm sorry, I'm going to get my names right. It was Jackie Robinson who walked through the door, but it was Satchel Paige who turned the key. And so they gave me the gift of Satchel Paige, and I wrote a book on him. They gave me an extra gift. After having spent 2 years, as I told you, living and breathing with the evil Joe McCarthy, they gave me the gift of my next book. The only people that the Pullman Porters loved more than they did Satchel Paige was 3 guys who played music named Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie. All 3 of them, in their later, more successful years, hired private Pullman sleeping cars with Pullman Porters manning those sleeping cars, and they got to, having spent their early years in broken down buses that barely made it from stop to stop, having spent their middle years in broken down cars, jalopies, that barely made it from stop to stop, in the end, they treated themselves and they treated their band members by having this most elegant form of travel in the Pullman car with the most elegant men in the world, Pullman Porters, taking care of them. And so the gift that the Pullman Porters had given me right now, and the gift that my publisher gave me in return for having spent 2 years with the evil Joe McCarthy, was to spend the next 2 years with these 3 extraordinary guys. And the reason my book is called How Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America is because I think they did in their world just what the Pullman Porters did in their different world, which was opening their bands to be biracial, playing to white audiences that would never have had a black person come near their home, they invited the records of these three extraordinary jazz maestros in, and they went out to watch them perform in ways that were transformative. And I would never have known this story. There have been a million books written about the three jazz guys I'm telling you about, but there has been very little written about the transformative effect they had, and I would never have understood it had it not been for the gift of the Pullman Porters. I want to end by telling you one gift that we may be about to give back to them. And I can't say the word gift without making a quick pitch here. I know you're all very generous, and I know you look like a very affluent audience. You could help with an extraordinary gift someday in whatever increment you could do to help them finish the restoration of this amazing Pullman car here. End of my pitch. I don't work for their marketing department, but I saw the car, and I saw the way it's lacking just a few things to have the finishing touches on one of the most amazing Pullman restoration projects anywhere. But the gift that I hope someday we can give back to the Porters, and this is a fantasy gift right now because it's probably never going to happen. But exactly a week ago, this is Sunday, at just about this time a week ago, I got a phone call from a guy named Chris Jackson. And I don't know if any of you ever saw the play Hamilton in New York. Did anybody see Hamilton? Did anybody happen to see it with the original cast? Yes. So I don't know if you remember an extraordinary guy who played George Washington, but it was a guy named Chris Jackson. And Chris Jackson was the black George Washington in Hamilton. Chris Jackson is now on a TV show that I am embarrassed to say I have never seen, but I'm sure it's a very good TV show called Bull. Yes, you know Bull? Great. So Chris Jackson has a dream in his life. The way he wants to give back for all the gifts that he's been given and all the success that he's had is he wants to tell the story of the Pullman Porters. And Chris Jackson is teaming up with a guy who I had to Google, and I'm embarrassed to say, named J.J. Abrams. You know who J.J. Abrams is? He's a guy in Hollywood who makes successful movies, I guess. And he's teaming up with him to do a series on the Pullman Porters. That they were supposed to either this past week or this next week meet with the president of HBO to talk about making this happen. And I'm told that J.J. Jackson's a hot commodity, and when he teams up with Chris Jackson, that it's got a shot. So we've gone from a 1 in a million chance of ever seeing this on a screen to now maybe a 1 in 10,000. And it's probably never going to happen, but I want to add one last piece, and my favorite piece of the story about what Chris Jackson told me on the phone last week. He said that he and the cast of Hamilton were meeting recently with Barack and Michelle Obama, and they told them about their Pullman Porter project. And because Michelle's great-grandfather is a Pullman Porter, Barack Obama said that if this dream ever becomes something other than a fantasy, that he will do a walk-on cameo on the TV story talking about the Pullman Porters. And the idea of Barack Obama ever telling the Pullman Porters story, to me, is the best gift that these Porters ever could have dreamed of. Having said that, they were also enough dreamers and enough realists that they would have predicted that someday all of this would have happened, that there would have been a Barack Obama in the White House. So what I want to do is actually end the story now, my part of it, and hear whether you have something other than my planted questions here, and anybody has any questions they'd like to ask on the Pullman Porters at all. The question was, what happened when Amtrak took over the overnight train service that the black porters seemed to disappear, and they did disappear, partly because they were
Overnight. Black porters to white porters.
they disappeared overnight, and that happened partly because they were old enough, and most of them were at retirement age, partly because Amtrak had other people, the whole system had changed then, partly because Amtrak wasn't good and didn't make sure they kept on the ones that were there. And so most of the porters who were not already at retirement age ended up showing up at airports as red caps, and that was where they went. So it was not a pleasant story, and honestly, nobody here is from Amtrak, are they? So Amtrak did me a favor, but also showed me some bad things. The year after my book came out, Amtrak wanted, during Black History Month, I became their talk, and I went to stations around the country, in Chicago and LA and a bunch of places, did talks. And what they paid me, instead of giving me a check for anything, because Amtrak didn't have any money, we all know, they gave me free Amtrak service for a year, anywhere I wanted to go. And what I saw was how terrible the service had become in terms of an overnight train on Amtrak. what I also saw is every time I travel in an Amtrak train, I try to bring with me a copy of my book. And anytime I see an African-American conductor, I will ask them, do you know the story of the Pullman porters on whose shoulders you are standing today? And I've never found one who knew any story in a Pullman porter. So I give them my book and say, this is the story the Pullman porters would want you to know about your heritage as an African-American working on a railroad. And it is scary to me. It's scary to me generally how little history we know in America. And it's scary to me how the story of the Pullman porters is disappearing with the Pullman porters, even with Amtrak and even on the railroads. Can I just say one quick thing about Satchel Paige? If you couldn't write a good book on Satchel Paige, then shame on you, because this guy was a biography waiting to happen. He was not just arguably the best pitcher in the history of baseball. He lasted until his last game was pitched, and there aren't many records you could say will never be broken in baseball, when he was 59 years old. He was hired by George Finley, Charlie Finley, who owned the Kansas City A's at the time. He set him up in the bullpen. Charlie Finley hadn't filled the ballpark once all year. He set him up in the bullpen, next to the bullpen, with a nurse in a rocking chair. He filled the ballpark that night, and that's all he cared about. Satchel Paige came out and pitched 3 shutout innings at age 59 against the Boston Red Sox. The only guy to get a hit off him was Carl Yastrzemski. Carl Yastrzemski went up after the game and gave him a bear hug. If you know Carl Yastrzemski doesn't give bear hugs. He did that because Satchel had pitched against Carl's potato farmer father on Long Island exactly a generation before. Satchel Paige pitched to kids, he pitched to their fathers and to their grandfathers. He was around forever, telling stories, pitching baseball, and showing what blacks could be in Major League Baseball. Ma'am? The question was, did Pullman porters, where did they stay in the train? What kind of quarters did they have? And the answer is, you're seeing an elegant private sleeping car right here, so it's a little bit different situation. But they had really cramped quarters. In the early days, they had really miserable quarters. In the post-A. Philip Randolph Union era, they had better quarters, but they would share, as you'll see out there, they had one bunk for the 2 Pullman porters who worked there, and they would sleep in shifts. They would be on call all night long. If somebody needed something, they would it was pretty lousy conditions. On the other hand, it got better over the years. The most important thing to them was not, though, how their sleeping quarters changed. The most important thing to them was Pullman porters were called during the early history of the railroads by racist passengers and by just dumb passengers. They were called George. And they were called George because there was a horrible tradition in the world of post-slavery to call people in the world of slavery, name them after their slave masters. And they were felt to be George Pullman slaves, and people called Pullman porters George. One of the earliest things, before he got them better working conditions, before he got them more money, one of the first things that A. Philip Randolph did was he got them name badges. And the name badges he knew were giving them a name and giving them dignity. My name is Happy Davis. My name is George Miller. My name is not George Pullman, and I'm not his slave. And only a guy as smart as A. Philip Randolph would have understood the symbolic value of the porters getting these badges. So the Pullman Strike was one of the most famous strikes in American industrial history, and it was an all-white strike, and it originated in the town of Pullman, Illinois, and if any of you ever go to Chicago and have a little extra time, take a train as far south as you can get, and you'll come to this little town called Pullman, Illinois, which was an industrial town where everybody who worked on George Pullman's trains, building them and working on them, who was white, could live. And it was an extraordinary place because one of the first company towns actually named after the guy. But there's no black history there. And there's very little history remembered of all the things, including the strike there today. It's cheap housing, nice housing, and whatever. But I wish I could say that they were part of this Deb's great. So my guess is we were talking probably 100,000 porters in the 100-year history. but maybe less than that. It was also a job, if you see my book anywhere, you will see that there are 3 sons and a father pictured on the book. It was a family named Smock. This was a job that was so cherished that fathers handed it down to sons who handed it down to grandsons. One of the only perks in the early days of being a Pullman porter, other than the things we talked about, was your recommendation that you knew somebody that they ought to hire often worked. And if they turned out to be a laggard, you suffered from it, but it was an incredible the thing to be able to hand down to your sons. One time for one, so that's a really good question, and my recollection is that the union represented Canadian porters, but a lot of African Americans generally during an era of Jim Crow escaped to Canada because Canada was friendlier to blacks, and a lot of porters who worked there loved the idea of working. First of all, they were on the elegant Trans-Canada Railroad. Who can beat that? But the other is that passengers were less likely to be racist jerks in Canada through a lot of those years. Ma'am?
I was going to say, my uncle was a Pullman porter, and so I was on the train in 1956. Now Seth had asked me, he said, was it integrated or whatever? And I said, I could not, obviously it was, but nothing that I would have noticed. We had dinner, and my aunt and I, they did not have children. That's another interesting thing. When I would spend a couple of weeks with my aunt and uncle in New Jersey, they did not have children. Their neighbor was also a Pullman porter. They had no children. And 2 or 3 other friends of my uncle, they were not men with big families, and these were very fastidious men. My uncle smoked a cigar, he kept his newspaper under his arm, and he would walk from the train station, the Plainfield train station, sharp shoes, camel hair coat, and this was something that these were fastidious men, and their private lives were very much the same. And it wasn't until after my uncle died and going through things, he always had that New York Times under him, that I came to realize that my uncle probably could read. Not enough but that kind of paper. I never saw him, but for these men, being who they were, being polished, he drank his coffee, that pinky, my sisters and brothers would always make fun of that. But your observation about what they observed, and his home, and the neighbor next door. So that's what I saw as a very similar and common thing among them.
So I want to just rest my case on the children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews being extraordinary people. And we just heard an extraordinary story about Pullman porters and about their legacy of producing people who are extraordinary and who remember them as being these amazing people. The only thing better in Black America of the era that we're talking about than walking around town with the uniform of a Kansas City Monarchs or another extraordinarily successful baseball team was walking in this blue uniform with gold buttons and a really distinguished looking hat. And everything about your appearance, not just the idea that they were fastidious, but their uniform and everything else said, these are special people, and that is the way their world treated them, and that is the way we should honor them today. And I think that's probably a note to end on.
Thank you so
Stephanie.
much.